The problem I want to take up is an excessive fearfulness in the middle class in Western cities like Melbourne. Excessive fearfulness to the point of paranoia at times. The most obvious example of this today is parents who chauffeur their children everywhere rather than letting them go out in public or take public transport, even chauffeuring them to and from school every day. Now, there's some lurking fear of child abduction. Now, in any realistic terms, the middle-class suburbs in Melbourne are as sort of crime-free as is historically possible. By any realistic historical comparisons, we have very, very low crime in our suburbs. And the risk of child abduction is infinitesimal. So what's going on? Why this excessive fearfulness? It's to do with violence. It's to do with fear of violence. So let me talk a little bit, and to a degree, I wanted a degree in mathematics. In retrospect, it was a complete waste of time, but it did teach me that when in doubt, go to first principles. So I'm going to try and do that. Violent power can be exhilarating. And let me give two personal examples. I remember as a boy on the beach at Beaumaris, down on the bay here, when US fighter jets flew overhead. You could hear them, specks on the horizon, slowly appearing, and then sudden whoosh, incredible noise, after supersonic after echo. Ducking my head, and these huge, vast silver bodies were shooting overhead, and there was something exhilarating about this sort of power, naked power. I also remember the 1993 football grand final. It wasn't a very good game. Essendon, my team, won very easily. One thing I do remember in the second quarter was when the thuggish Essendon player, Dean Wallace, went charging at a Carlton backman, launched himself into the air and hit him with a hip to the shoulder and shoulder to the head. The Carlton backman went ricocheting sideways like a rag doll. 90,000 people suddenly went silent, and the Carlton player crashed to the ground. I remember a sort of thrill of exhilaration, which I didn't express externally because I had enough bad conscience that this was unscrupulous thuggery. But carried away in the moment, any compassion for the unconscious player or the sense of good sportsmanship being breached was completely gone. And football does in part play upon an attraction to fast-moving men on the edge of violence, and I think in the viewer a sort of alternating good and bad conscience about that. Violence is hard to talk about. We are so civilized and so delicate and controlled in this area. It's very dangerous territory, I think, in which to try to be honest. And the best guide, I think, in general, to understanding what's going on in one's times are the great works of art. The most insightful, the best works of art of the time. To my mind, in the contemporary West, the most interesting works have all come from American television. And in particular, three series: The Sopranos, Deadwood, and Mad Men. I'm sure all of you know one or more of these television series. Very significantly, both of the first two are extremely violent. So part of the attraction to The Sopranos and to Deadwood is the fact that extreme violence is being perpetrated. Sopranos, and I'll focus mainly on it, is, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's about the New Jersey Mafia, and in particular the head or the boss of the gang, Tony Soprano. Now, all the ordinary people in The Sopranos, and this certainly, I think this applies to the viewers of The Sopranos too, are fascinated by the mob, by the mafia. I think it's a similar thing that makes series like Underbelly, about local crime here, so popular. It's a similar thing that makes figures like chopper read, so fascinating. It's all to do with violence. Tony Soprano undergoes psychoanalysis for most of the 6 series of the program. His analyst, Dr. Melfi, whenever she goes out amongst friends or colleagues, other psychoanalysts, the one thing they're all interested in asking her, what's happening with Tony Soprano? Absolutely fascinated. Now, one has to take into account that psychoanalysts, counsellors are people who spend their lives in very controlled, civilized manner, talking quietly and calmly to people about their nightmares, hour after carefully controlled hour. You couldn't get anything at the further extreme. They are sort of caricatures of the suburbs that I started this talk with. Now, they are irresistibly drawn to interest in a man who's a vicious brute, who will kill people without a blink, who break bones, who is quite unscrupulous. They're almost like sort of heroin addicts who see a syringe. So what's going on? It seems at the utmost extreme from the lives of these very, very affluent, successful, civilised, middle-class men and women, the psychoanalysts. We really the viewers of the program sit in the same chair as Dr. Melfi, and we view Tony Soprano with ambivalence. The analysts at one stage call him a sociopath, and what they mean by that is a sort of someone who can inflict violence with no bad conscience at all, but unlike a psychopath, he's actually aware of what he's doing. He's got conscious. He has a moral consciousness, if not much moral conscience. Dr. Melfi doesn't want to know, wants to turn the proverbial blind eye to the extremes of what Tony does. But Tony's a good family man. He's a good father. He's close to his daughter. He's actually a good father to a very difficult teenage son. He's warm to his wife in spite of lots of affairs. He's particularly warm to her whenever he's sort of worrying about the meaning of life, which is quite frequently. Tony has a sort of an attractive male decisiveness, strength. He's a good leader of the gang. He is insightful into the motives of others, and he can act quickly and usually with good judgment and decisively. The sort of the positive, the attractive sides of Tony. So why? What's going on? What's the attraction? I think there are 2 readings. There are 2 possible readings of, and I'm back with in middle class Camberwell and Baldwin with children being ferried everywhere in cars in case they get abducted. The two are closely related. What's going on? There's a benign reading here. The benign reading would go something like, middle class life today is too secure. It's too bureaucratised. It's the good life requires some adventure, some risk, some drama, some sort of dynamism, sort of taking on the unexpected, some sort of movement. Modern middle class life is out of balance. It's too protected. It's too genteel. So what the Sopranos does is it sort of provides a sort of imaginative compensation for a life that's out of balance. You can sort of, through identification with the New Jersey Mafia, sort of gain something of those life experiences that you're missing in your carefully closeted in your suburbs. The harsher reading is there's some identification with Tony Soprano, with sadistic viciousness. If I'm right that this excessive fearfulness is paranoid or is it makes some sense to call it paranoid, then we need to take into account sort of psychological analysis of paranoia, which suggests that individuals who are paranoid project things from inside themselves out onto people they fear, people they think are going to do them harm, attack them. There is a projection outwards from things inside oneself. Or paranoid people often persecute people they then imagine as hateful for one reason or another. Now, if this reading is correct here, Dr. Melfi, the other analysts, and actually the viewers of the program are drawn to Tony Soprano because they, buried deep inside, have some similar demons, some similar sort of Tony Soprano viciousness lurks within them. The program is very sophisticated. It is artistically very, very, very sophisticated. It goes into a sort of debate about whether Tony is a psychopath or not, or whether he's sort of a more moderate human being. There are other criminal members of the gang who are psychopaths, who have no normal capacity for attachment or engagement. There's a Ralphie who beats his girlfriend to death because she's insulted his masculinity. Tony then beats him up. The program sort of makes clear that Tony is not like that. At times he is out of control, but then he checks himself. He stands back. He's capable of gathering himself. On the harsher reading of what's going on with the attraction to the Sopranos, to Deadwood, and the fearfulness in the middle-class suburbs, a sign of demons within is many of our behaviour when we're out of control, when we're in a sort of mania, when we lose our normal controls. And I think of Homer's Iliad, in which the most gentle and likeable and kind and compassionate of the warriors, Patroclus, the moment he's in the heat of battle, gets carried away and behaves like a sadistic brute. I think of Alexander the great builder of civilized cities, whom, after his bosom companion dies, he's in such a rage that he has the poor innocent doctor who looked after his companion, crucified. Alexander the Great, completely out of control. And when I could go on and on and on. Tony Soprano himself, if he's taken over by powerful rage, behaves in ways that are not much different from a psychopath before he quickly gathers himself. So where does this leave us? I think it leaves us with a civilized paradox. A civilized paradox. National myths are always linked to violent events, usually wars. I mean, Gallipoli, in the Australian case, speaks for itself. It produces a myth of men who share a sort of brotherhood, a camaraderie, a capacity for fun and engagement and joking with each other. But men who, in many cases, when they come back from war, find ordinary life dull and somehow not really living, that somehow it was at war that life was real, that the blood moved, that this was exciting, this is what life was really about. I think there's a suggestion in The Sopranos too, quite a taunting suggestion with the way that people are drawn to Tony Soprano, of a similar thing, and this is really challenging to us middle class, that somehow life is at the full when it's close to violence. It's at its best, it's at its height when it's close to violence. The civilized hope, of course, is that this can be sublimated, that violent power can be sublimated. And in the third of the American television series that I mentioned, Mad Men, the central figure is not a violent man. He has strong male presence, but he's not a violent man. There is, however, a very strong caution in Mad Men, in that the central figure, Don Draper, doesn't have any strong pleasures or any deep attachments. This is partly because his life is a lie. his identity, his sense of himself and his sense of his own identity is extraordinarily precarious because he's living a lie. Tony Soprano himself alternates between being the big, powerful man who everyone fears and a modern individual who basically thinks that he's empty and his life is meaningless. So where am I at the end of these reflections? Our modern civilized middle-class conscience tends to the view that we humans are basically nice, sort of a humanitarian fantasy. We humans are basically nice, and when we're not, it's due to bad influences in our childhood or in our society. Now, if we believe that, we're kidding ourselves. Programs like The Sopranos open the eyes to the fact that deep down our unconscious, we know that is not true. The easy conclusion from my remarks is balance is a good thing. The problem in our middle-class suburbs is lack of balance. Restore the balance and everything will be fine. The more troubling conclusion is that sadism is universal, that a human tendency to live, and this is more male than female, but it's certainly not entirely more male than female, a human tendency to live on the edge of violence somehow brings us close to the deep truths about the human condition. The main story, the main Western story, clearly is the Jesus story. The Jesus story centres on the crucifixion, which is about as violent a climax as you can possibly get. There is something about violent tragedy and deep truth in relationship to us humans. Thank you.